I'm Maren and welcome back to my channel, Maren Makes It. Today I'm here to compare sleeping in a tent versus sleeping in the car as camping options. Growing up, we always camped in a tent as a family, and I definitely had some good and some bad experiences. Over the last half year, I've mainly camped out of my car, and so I have a lot of experience with that now as well. There was definitely times where I really wished that I had a tent instead of just camping out of my car, but it's important to remember that there's always going to be pros and cons to both of the options. So I'm here to go through some of those pros and cons with you so that you can decide which one is right for you. I thought about also adding a van to this comparison video because it's kind of a similar method of camping. However, I decided it had to kind of be in a league of its own because it's much more expensive to do this if you don't already have one. You have a lot more options for temperature control in a van, so that can be a much more long-term solution, whereas a tent or sleeping in the car is more of a short-term situation. I know very few places in the USA where you can actually camp in a car or in a tent year-round. If you don't have scorching heat in the summer, combined possibly with humidity, then you likely have really long cold winters. So other than Southern California, I'm not really sure where you do this. That being said, let's get into the nitty-gritty of car versus tent. The first advantage of being in a tent is that you can definitely stretch out a lot more than you can in a car. In my car, it was honestly not even possible for me to fully sit up when I was sitting on the bed. Depending on how big your tent is, you might even be able to stand up. Sitting is definitely going to be an option, and this makes certain things, such as changing your clothes, for example, quite a bit easier. You can likely also lay down in your tent and be completely flat and stretched out, as opposed to in the car where you're always going to be a little bit more cramped. When you're camping in a car, you're really limited to just one person or maybe two, depending on the size of your vehicle. When you have a tent, whether you have 2 people or 10 people, you can find a tent that works for you guys. The great thing about this is too that you can invite friends to come with you. You can be alone, but you could also have people with you. It gives you a lot of flexibility. If your friends don't have any camping gear, this way you can invite them to come without the burden being on them of having to try and find a tent or trying to set up something in their car on their own. Additionally, a lot of places you pay by the number of cars. So for example, going into a state park or national park, you're oftentimes not paying for the number of people in your car, but rather for the number of cars. So if you and your friends each bring in your own car camping setup, you might have to get multiple camp spots and you might have to be paying multiple times in order for all of your cars to come in with you. Paying for just one site for all of you guys and then coming in with a big tent might end up saving a lot of money here. So the pro of being in a tent is that it packs up during the day and it doesn't look like you're sleeping in your car, which can come with some stigma and definitely some weird looks and glances, especially from older people, or when you're in city areas, people definitely look twice at you and your car. So you are bringing a little bit extra attention to yourself that you might not want to be attracting. The last pro of camping in a tent is something that I would have never thought about until this past summer. So a lot of campgrounds are, especially during the busy summer months, have a lot of first come first serve spots, or possibly the entire campground is run that way. And for these really popular destinations, such as the national parks, you really have to get there at 2 or 3 p.m. in order to actually get a spot. And so now let's say, great, you get there at 2 or 3 p.m., but you're gonna be camping in your car. Well, now you have nothing to leave at the campground in order to reserve that spot for you. Most people would either set up their tent or drop their camper off and then they'd take their car and go exploring in the national park, because sometimes the visitor center or the attractions are like 10 or 12 miles away from where the actual campground is. Then you picture me rolling up in my car and I'm like, okay, great, what do I do to reserve this spot for me? Do I just sit here from 3 o'clock to whatever 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. when it gets dark? Or do I leave a smaller item here in order to reserve my spot, like a suitcase or a chair or a bag? But it felt like there was a lot more risk of somebody taking that and just kind of leaving with it, as opposed to somebody stealing somebody's entire tent setup or the camper that they left there. I usually ended up stringing my hammock across the camping spot in some trees as a way to reserve the spot. Luckily, I didn't have a very expensive hammock, so I wasn't going to be that mad if it did actually get taken somewhere. It did not, but if it did happen, I wasn't going to be so torn up about it. However, this is kind of a weird scenario to be in that I definitely hadn't anticipated ahead of time. So for the cons of the tent, the first one is definitely cleanup. It's always going to take you longer, no matter how fast or practiced you get at doing this, to take apart the poles, unzip the tent, fold everything back together, get it to fit back into that bag, and then roll up any mats or sleeping bags that you've been using inside the tent. That's always going to take you longer than just basically getting in the driver's seat of your car, out of your bed, and starting to drive. I can see this cleanup and setup time especially becoming a problem if you are moving destinations a lot. If you're, say, going somewhere and you're going to camp for a week there and this is like a weekly thing, that is one thing. But if you are moving spots every day, then that cleanup and setup time is really going to start to add up. If you're doing that setup, it's a lot harder to do it at night, especially if you're by yourself, whereas in the car, you don't really have to worry about this issues. If you don't already have a tent, this can also get kind of expensive. So if you look at good quality tents, they're kind of not that cheap. And especially if you're camping really infrequently and you don't already have a tent, you might really want to think about how many nights you're actually going to be using this thing for, and if it would be cheaper to just stay in a motel or in an Airbnb. If your tent costs you $200 and you're going to be using it for 3 nights in the whole year, it might actually be cheaper to try and get a motel depending on where you're located. There's a lot of kind of expensive accessories that can come with a tent, because you're not just sleeping in that tent. Like, we know you want a sleeping bag, you're gonna need a mat to lay on at the very minimum, maybe some kind of air mattress depending on how fancy you want to get, and maybe a tarp for the rain. There's definitely a lot of add-ons here that can really add up quickly, and that's not even talking about the expense of having to pay for a camping site and a campground. Especially if you're going on the weekends or in a very peak time of year like the summertime. In certain areas, for example, Southern California, they were very expensive, plus a fee, like a sales fee and a campground fee usually. So this can really start to add up quickly. And now if you add that to the cost of your tent, you might honestly be better off just staying in an Airbnb or a hotel. Then again, if camping is something you're really looking to get into and you view this tent and your camping equipment as more of an investment, good quality gear can definitely last you. Really what it comes down to is looking at your cost per use. So about how many times do you plan to use it versus what is the cost of this item. That's what I would take into consideration to decide, what kind of tent you want to invest in, how big and how good quality, and then also, how often are you realistically going to use that thing. Good quality camping gear can last you years or even decades. However, if you're not using it, your cost per use is still going to be really high. Another con of buying a tent and having all this extra camping gear is that if you're already living in a small apartment or a space where storage is an issue, you're now going to have these added things that you're going to have to store for the 360 days a year that you're not using them. The last major con that I see of a tent is really just more exposure to the elements. Yeah, like I know technically a tent is waterproof, just like we know technically a raincoat is waterproof. However, if you have multiple days of rain and the ground's already really soggy and muddy, that will eventually get into your tent, no matter how waterproof that material is. Whereas in a car, you're really kind of in this capsule and rain is really not going to get to you unless you have a broken or leaking window. The car always stays a little bit warmer because you're up off the ground compared with camping. So camping, I think the temperature of the tent inside matches the outside air temperature more. So that can be a pro or a con, I guess. In hotter weather, you're definitely better off in a tent where you can have more airflow and where at night it cools down a little bit faster in the tent. However, in cooler weather, it's definitely nice to be in a car where you're up off the ground, your heat is a little bit more contained and insulated. I usually found that inside my car was about 4 to 5 degrees hotter when I was sleeping in there in the morning than what the outside temperature said it would be. So that's quite significant if it's outside going to be like 30 and then inside going to be 35, or 45 versus 50. That does make quite a big difference in how comfortable you are. While it may temporarily, at least before it gets too damp, protect you from rain and the elements, it definitely is not lightning proof to be in a tent. You're not necessarily more likely to get struck by lightning being in a tent versus being outside, but it definitely isn't protecting you either. So most tents these days, the poles are actually made not out of steel and aluminum anymore, but out of carbon fiber. So this means that it's not a very good conductor of electricity. However, there's definitely still other factors to consider when trying to figure out if it's going to be safe to be in a tent in a thunderstorm. As a general rule, just try to avoid being in a tent in a thunderstorm. However, what matters way more if you do find yourself in this situation is not so much the tent or what the poles are made of themselves, but actually the surrounding area. If you're camping in a forest and your tent is really small compared to all the trees, you're definitely a lot better off than when you are in an open meadow, for example, or exposed at high altitude or on kind of an open rocky area. These are all situations where you and your tent are now the tallest object and you are a lot more of a target for that lightning. Whereas in a forest or a situation with maybe buildings or taller structures around, those structures are going to get hit by the lightning first. It's basically the same rules as if you were not in your tent that apply for if you were in your tent in a thunderstorm. While a tent is a great visual barrier, at the end of the day, if you really think about it, it's just a sheet of fabric hanging between you and the outside. And that can make it easier for things to get in that are just annoying, like little mosquitoes that will bite you during the night, and somehow they always seem to find me. But it can also be a real question of your safety. So when it comes to bears or larger animals, as well as other humans being able to get in. A tent you can cut through, you could take a knife through, you can just unzip it, you can bite through it if you're a bear maybe. It's a lot easier to get into that tent than it is to smash the windows of a car in order to get inside that car. I would much rather have a metal, plastic, and glass door between me and that animal or that other human trying to get at me as opposed to just a sheet of fabric hanging there.